Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The public spending watchdog has laid bare the hugely inflated prices the Westminster government ended up paying for personal protective equipment as the pandemic began to bite. The National Audit Office said that stockpiles were low and that competing for PPE with other countries cost the taxpayer an extra £10 billion. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning reports.
At Felixstowe Port, amongst the containers, a sign of England's PPE problems. 4,000 containers of protective equipment still sitting there, causing logjams, because most of the government's PPE orders didn't arrive for the first COVID peak.
At the beginning of the pandemic, the government hadn't built up its stockpile of PPE enough. So there were only 9 days' worth of goggles left, 7 days' worth of protective aprons, and as for gowns, there weren't even enough to last a day. And that meant the government had to buy with prices rocketing. The price of body bags and the price of gowns went up by more than 1,000%. The price of gloves went up by more than 500%.
The spending watchdog found more than £12 billion was spent buying PPE. If it had been bought at prices the year before, £10 billion could have been saved. The shortages left staff feeling vulnerable, risking their lives. Some lost them. Maharaja Mohadeen was a nurse. She died in April of coronavirus. She did have diabetes, but her family claimed she lacked proper PPE.
Well, it's devastating, especially as frontline workers, as the government, as the NHS that we trust in. It should just be natural to just provide anything and everything that will help. It's really hard, you know, it's really hard losing someone like that.
There you go, so that's your masks and your 2 boxes of gloves.
The report also highlights how care companies in particular came close to running out of PPE.
It was a little bit of sort of the Wild West in truth. We were being offered face masks at 95 pence per face mask. So a 1,500% increase in price from the original purchase that we made. We were able to find these face masks for better value than we were being offered by government-sanctioned providers.
In the summer, the BBC revealed 150 million face masks from Ayanda Capital couldn't be used in the NHS, despite the firm saying they met specifications. This disclosed in court documents to campaign group The Good Law Project. The report says there could be millions more items of PPE that are also unsuitable. The Prime Minister challenged about what was ordered.
So will the Prime Minister come clean? How many hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted on equipment that can't be used?
Prime Minister.
99.5% of the PPE, the 32 billion items of PPE that this country has secured, conformed entirely to our clinical needs once we checked it.
At the start of the pandemic, a huge effort was made to get PPE, but prices were high and supplies low. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, one of the biggest items in the Chancellor's massive spending spree over the last few months has been the £12.5 billion spent on PPE, personal protective equipment, for healthcare workers. But today, the public spending watchdog said that huge expenditure was the result of government buying gloves, masks and gowns when global prices were soaring. Ministers had relied on a stockpile that proved inadequate when the crisis hit, and the system was overwhelmed by the scale of demand for these items. Our economics correspondent Helia Abrahimi reports.
This is the kind of spending the government would like you to remember.
Where's it going to go?
Billions of pounds of PPE being sent out to the front line in the teeth of the pandemic. But what's inside the boxes, Mr. Hancock? The government watchdog today confirmed what this programme reported earlier this year, that much of the UK's stockpile was in fact out of date. In its second report, the National Audit Office says the UK emergency stockpile was inadequate, that it came within a day of running out of vital stock, that we spent £12.5 billion on 32 billion items of PPE that would have been £10 billion cheaper if bought pre-crisis. That despite this, fewer than 1 in 10 of the 32 billion items bought reached frontline staff by July. that much of it still hasn't arrived and some still hasn't even been manufactured.
It makes you feel angry because if we are meant to have in place planning for pandemics, if we're meant to have done kind of large-scale planning operations for this, and then when you hit one of these pandemics, the equipment is not there that is needed, that's not good enough. It put lives at risk, put intense emotional pressure on frontline healthcare staff, and it could have been avoided.
But the picture that is painted by the NAO is of a government scrambling to play catch-up, too focused on cost savings in the run-up to the crisis, than too late to understand its PPE stockpile wasn't enough. The UK had its first confirmed COVID case at the end of January. In February, SAGE warned the government about the consequences of the pandemic. But it wasn't until March that ministers developed a full estimate of what was needed and focused on ramping up PPE procurement. On April the 1st, the parallel supply chain was created because the system could no longer cope. This is just days before hospital cases peaked, and by late April, PPE is close to running out. The early days of the pandemic exposed how dangerously reliant the UK health system was on Chinese imports and how prices were spiralling beyond recognition. The report shows how the government started to turn to new ways of sourcing PPE, with half the money spent going to new UK suppliers, many of which had little or no experience in the PPE market. The bigger problem seems to be that many of those companies turned out not to be manufacturers, but instead middlemen who were also buying from China. In Liverpool, one UK company that has been manufacturing for 50 years says it didn't get a look in, while newer businesses with apparent Tory links were fast-tracked.
I know a lot of these companies aren't actually producing in the UK. They are a UK company who are buying everything in. We can manufacture in the UK, we could create jobs and we could save jobs. And this is what we haven't been able to do.
Jan Roby's experience also highlights how chaotic the procurement system became, with the NAO concluding that the government was overwhelmed by March.
We get calls from people saying, right, we need masks, and we've said, okay, we can do it in 3 weeks, we can get them done in 3 weeks. Well, we need them tomorrow. Well, you can't have 40,000 masks tomorrow. You have to plan for these, you have to get the fabric, you have to book the production slots, and we just found that people didn't get that.
That chaos has resulted in Britain owning an estimated 5-year supply of PPE, all bought in those frenzied months at the peak of the market. Given today's news about record public spending, the case study in emergency PPE will leave many alarmed about how much of this will be value for money.
Now, civil servants have been grilled by MPs over the billions of pounds spent on personal protective equipment at the very height of the pandemic. There was enormous pressure to find protective clothing for NHS staff and care home workers as the virus took hold in the spring. But MPs have been frustrated by the answers they have received about how and why such huge sums were spent. Our economics correspondent, Helia Ibrahimi, has this.
Today, Whitehall was in the dock over its handling of the PPE crisis amid accusations of corruption, an engulfing scandal of mismanaged contracts, wealthy middlemen and faulty stock. Civil servants failed to quell MP anger and seemed hard-pressed to provide the details demanded.
How many companies are you investigating?
The vast majority of the orders have arrived or the contracts are ongoing. So I think.
And then, a common refrain.
I don't have the exact number to hand, but we could.
So you've come to this committee on this issue. You don't know how many companies. I mean, there's been huge publicity and real concern by taxpayers, notwithstanding that lots of people put a lot of effort in the pandemic to get this to the front line. We get that, we bank that, but there were problems with some of these. So you can't tell me now at all ballpark figure how many investigating, single figures?
Already the National Audit Office has censured government for its conduct, saying that PPE contracts had not been transparent, that checks were only done at times retrospectively, and that a secret VIP lane had been set up, which opened ministers up to accusations of cronyism. In Westminster, politicians wanted to know how we got into such trouble.
I must stop you there. I really must. This was the senior nurse in a major NHS hospital. Can you lend me 20 masks? The hospital down the road put 10 masks in a taxi. It was at that level we were trying to get our supplies. That's a pretty shocking situation, isn't it?
Look, I absolutely accept that the availability of PPE right at the front line was not consistently where you would want it to be.
Not consistently where you would want it to be. That's how David Williams described the situation, which saw Britain just one day away from running out of PPE at the peak of the crisis. Then a whole load of semantics about the high priority lane, which gave many with links to the Tory party and government officials an inside track on multi-million-pound deals.
Can you tell me exactly who that high priority lane was set up for?
Mr. Williams.
The purpose of this sort of high priority list, I prefer the description list rather than lane.
Whether list or lane, it was heavily criticised by the NAO, as was the credibility of some of the biggest contracts awarded to businesses with no track record and some with no accounting history at all.
We are seeking redress where we've had contracts that have been delivered to.
But if these are dodgy companies, any of them, then you won't get the money back, will you? If they're Phoenix companies, so they just go under. Let's call a spade, so that could happen, where some of these companies are so unchecked because of the speed at which you're working. Let's put it, we're not due diligence that Mr. Sean Bailey's talked about couldn't or wasn't done. So some of those companies might not be here long enough to get the money back from.
That
could happen.
One company singled out by the watchdog is Ianda, awarded a £253 million contract despite being an offshore property and finance fund. 50 million of its masks haven't been used by the NHS, but its boss, city financier Tim Horlick, says the mistake is the government's.
I personally think it's scandalous they're not being used, and there is no reason for them not to be used. And we understand that they may actually have been put back into the NHS supply chain.
Do you feel a certain amount of shame?
I don't feel any shame for our contract or our delivery, which was perfectly executed and perfectly delivered. The NHS is already supplied by very large private sector companies who probably make much bigger margins than most of the vendors this time round. So clearly the media are interested in new companies that came in and made money, but I don't think it's any different really to how they were being supplied before.
That may be true, but it's unlikely to satisfy the critics, who believe money has been wasted and questions remain unanswered about why some companies were chosen over others.
Now, in the desperate scramble to acquire scarce supplies of PPE, ventilators and COVID testing kits during the first wave of the pandemic, the government handed out hundreds of contracts worth billions of pounds. An investigation carried out by the New York Times claims that much of that cash went to companies with links to the Conservative Party or with no prior experience in the field. Porrick O'Brien has more. Porrick.
Well, John, the background first. It's March this year. The pandemic has grabbed the country by the scruff of the neck, and British officials are scrambling to procure as much personal protective equipment as they can. So cue the government handing out thousands of contracts to purchase PPE. Part of the problem at the time, as we've reported on this programme, was that a proportion of that PPE was out of date. The New York Times, in its reporting today, has analysed a chunk of those contracts, 1,200 of them that have been made public together, worth a staggering £18 billion. Now, according to the New York Times, half of that, £9 billion, went to companies that were either run by friends and associates of politicians in the Conservative Party or to companies with either no prior experience or a history of controversy. This reporting echoes work done, you'll remember, by the National Audit Office last month, which said that not enough was done at the time to address potential conflicts of interest by ministers and other government officials. For their part, the government has reiterated again, saying that proper due diligence was carried out on all of these contracts, and of course important to say again that this was an emergency, that the priority was to try and get as much PPE as quickly as possible. I think what this reporting will do, though, is it will turn up the dial when it comes to pressure on the government to be more transparent about these contracts and who got them. And today, off the back of the New York Times piece, Meg Hillier, Labour's chair of the Public Accounts Committee, has again called for a full list of these companies and the contracts that they got to be made public.